I'm not banning you from having children. Your choices and your body has made it difficult for you to have a family.
I have a family that I wouldn't be able to have in your regime.
I'm not saying that you guys are not loving your children.
You just want to create a world in which it's not possible.
I want to create a world where they don't have to lose their mother to come into existence. Children are made from a man and woman. Statistically, they're most likely to thrive when they're raised by that man and woman in a permanent relationship. The family serves the child, not the other way around. At some point, every adult is going to have to say, who comes first? Is it the kids or is it me?
There are all kinds of ways in which real-life families fall short of the ideal of the family. Mm-hmm. And the only example that you're focusing on and comparing to the ideal is mine.
I'm not saying it's a small thing to put them before us. I just don't think that it means that children should struggle so we don't have to.
Nor do I, if it were true that children were struggling. There's a 2010 study in 2020, 2023, and they found that the kids in same-sex parent families perform better in school. Mm-hmm. So do you want to just tell me why all those are wrong?
I think that the data doesn't tell the whole story.
Well, no, it's a fundamentally a moral conviction of yours, which means it's basically a religious conviction.
I'm the one that's religious when you're promoting a worldview that has existed for 5 minutes of history that overrides everything that we know about the nature of the parent-child relationship. You are the one with the religious worldview here, not me.
Bring it. It's called Uncomfortable Conversations for a reason. G'day, humans. Welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas. Well, this show is called Uncomfortable Conversations, and this episode does what it says on the tin. Katy Faust is a child's rights activist and a family values Christian speaker and commentator in the United States. The dangerous idea under consideration today is whether or not gay parenting should be banned. Actually, should we ban any family structure that does not prioritize the right of every child to have a biological mother and a biological father in a nuclear family arrangement? That is the basic position of Katy. She's the founder of a non-profit that works towards that goal. It's called Them Before Us. And she publishes and speaks and testifies as a conservative social commentator widely on issues of marriage and family matters of justice for children. This includes, in particular, surrogacy, IVF. We talk a bit about adoption and about divorce and so on. And Katy has been, I must say, shunned by a lot of woke people. She's even been shunned by people like Dave Rubin, who's this anti-woke commentator in America who claims to be a brave champion who's willing to fight the fight. But all he did to Katy was block her on social media and never talk to her, which I don't think is, I mean, talk about being a snowflake. That is not the right approach here. The position that Katy articulates is increasingly popular in the United States. There is a declining support for gay marriage there. There is a concern that the whole thing has gone a bit too far with LGBTQIA plus and so on, and that we've lost sight of what is right for the children. So I wanted to tackle this head on. I'm enormously respectful and grateful to Katy for coming on this show. She did Jordan Peterson's podcast. She did John Anderson's podcast. She's got a sort of a rising star, and for her to make the time while she was in Australia to come into the Dragon's Den, so to speak, and speak to someone whose lifestyle and ideas she completely and fundamentally disagrees with is admirable. She's actually a former pastor's wife. She was raised by a lesbian mother, so to some extent she knows of which she speaks. I hope you enjoy as much as I genuinely did this rumble with the one, the only, Katy Faust. Do you find Australians are receptive to your message?
I think everybody's receptive to my message. Just because
she says humbly.
I know, because what I talk about goes down to the fundamentals, the non-negotiables of what it means to be a human, specifically what it means to be a human child. And I think that when you can bring it down to that level, you actually find an awful lot of agreement. Whereas a lot of the ways that we talk about this can be in really political kind of spaces, but when you kind of peel back all of those different defensiveness or kind of political, not posturing, because I think people really believe it, but when you can take it out of the realm of what adults want and you can get down to what does it mean to be a human child, you can't argue with a lot of that.
Is that harder to do in America because of the heat of the culture wars? My sense when I talk about issues in the States is that people are more likely to put you into a particular camp and then prejudge what you're saying without really listening to what you're saying.
100%.
And we all have, there are all these issues like the one that your issue. then there's Israel and Gaza, then there's immigration. Then
I tried
there's,
to read what you just published about Israel and Gaza, but it was behind a paywall.
Oh,
yeah,
that's unfortunate.
I know, but if you want to give me your hot take, I want to hear your hot take.
Oh my goodness. I've done about 15 long editorials about it since October 7th, so there isn't an easy hot take, except that I'll send that piece to you, but as you can imagine, I've been living in a world of pain for the past couple of weeks about it. Because
where are you at? Don't leave me hanging.
Oh, well, the world of pain at the moment was that I have traditionally, since October 7th, been the person who is critical of anti-Zionists and saying, you've lost your minds a little bit about this just because you're looking at the brutality in Gaza, but you're not understanding the full context of what Israel is up against. And then I felt like there came a time earlier this year where I could no longer be on board with the extent of the devastation in Gaza. And so the article was basically saying, yes, a lot of the things that anti-Zionists are accusing Israel of are deranged. Yes. And still, as Jews, as diaspora Jews specifically, we should find a way of articulating a vision of our Jewishness that isn't joined at the hip to the IDF. We have to have an ability for Israel not to be the thing that we're always reflexively defending because it's endangering Jews and it's morally simplistic at this stage. So let's find a way to think about our Jewishness outside of Israel. Of course,
that cracks me up because I'm like, you've got 40 books that have been time tested, that have an incredible cohesion to it. Can you find that identity there? Right, but there's a defensiveness. Again, it's tribal. It's like, it's like people aren't listening. People don't listen to the first 800 words of the article. They only focus on the final few words because those are the ones that trigger them. And I assume that similarly with you, people don't necessarily listen to exactly what it is that you're saying. They just go, she's an enemy of LGBTQIA plus rights. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which I probably am, depending on how you define it.
Yeah. Okay, so let me let you define it. So them and us.
Yeah.
Who's the them? Who's the us? What's the objective?
Yeah, so the nonprofit I run is called Them Before Us.
Sorry, Them Before Us,
That's fine. It's hard when, it's all pronouns.
Yep.
You don't know anything about what I'm doing based on the name.
Who are the they? Who are the we? Who's the us? Who's the them?
This is Katy of Me Before You.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's all kinds of challenges.
Okay, I'm just hoping I'm not the first person to fuck it up. So,
it's not.
Yeah, okay,
You're not.
Good.
Them as children, them before us. The idea is when it comes to children's concrete rights and needs, the children come first. And I tell most people that interview me, that is a perspective and a philosophy and a worldview that will confront every adult at some point. At some point, every adult is going to have to say, is it me or is it them? Who comes first? Is it the kids or is it me? And so children have fundamental natural rights, concrete rights. They may not be reflected in our civil law, but they are natural rights that can be discovered through the system of natural law, right? A way of understanding what we ought to do in the world based on looking at the world around us, right? What is self-evident. And so the idea that children have, for example, a right to life, pretty well established. I think humans have a right to life. So then you have to get down to when does life begin? And you can have that conversation, I think, solidly on the side of at the moment of conception. But then there's also a right that children have to be known and loved by both their mother and father. Just like adults have a right to take their baby home from the hospital. There's something special about their relationship to that child. Generally, when a husband and wife have a baby and leave the hospital, they don't want just any kid in the nursery. They want one specific kid. And they have a natural right to that one specific kid. So similarly, children also have a natural right to be known and loved by the two people responsible for their existence. Now, if that is true, if children have a right to life, and if they have a right to their mother and father, at some point, every adult is going to have to sacrifice and bend. There's no adult, single, married, gay, straight, fertile, or infertile, that can do whatever they want, that gets a pass. Every adult at some point will have to say, I'm going to do what my children need. I'm going to do what's best for them. I may not get what I want. So I tell people, give me enough time and I will trigger you too, because at some point it's going to run up against every adult's self-interest.
And so the policy implications of this would be, you just touched on abortion, would
Massive.
be a pro-life or anti-abortion stance. They would be in opposition to all forms of surrogacy, IVF, artificial creation of life, trading in babies and all that sort of stuff. What else are there? Is there anything big that I'm missing?
Divorce.
Divorce. Would you outlaw divorce?
I would return to more of an at-fault divorce framework, what Brad Wilcox at the Institute for Family Studies refers to as divorce justice. I think that there should be justice when a marriage breaks down, justice in terms of affirming and supporting the faithful spouse, because what no-fault divorce very often is unilateral divorce, one person being divorced against their will. Very often divorce becomes giving the most power to the spouse that wants the marriage the least, or the most misbehaving spouse will often get the most, is maybe driving the process, whereas the innocent spouse, the faithful spouse, the one that's trying to keep it together, the one that's willing to go to therapy, very often has a lot of the...
Right. Well, I'm not sure that it's true that the most faithful spouse is necessarily the one who's trying to keep it together. I mean, it may be that one of the spouses is misbehaving and being,
Yes.
and is screwing around, and the other one wants to leave, and then the one who's misbehaved is the one who's trying to beg for forgiveness and keep it together. Should the person who has been wronged not have the right to exit that relationship that the other person has betrayed?
We used to call that fault, right? There used to be a couple categories. Okay, so what marriage was, going back religiously, from a civil perspective, from an institutional perspective, it was the uniting of two people who had the capacity to create and raise children, and then the cultural and legal reinforcement of that relationship because it benefited not just the adults, the children, and therefore all of society. But throughout history, religious institutions, civil institutions, different governments have recognized that there's reasons why you might need to exit that marriage. And they would say, when one party is at fault of breaking their commitment to having to hold the rich or poor, better or worse till death do us part. Like, it's a commitment to, with my body I thee serve, is how we used to say it, which my daughter and her husband said in their wedding vows when they got married 6 months ago. And I was like,
You like,
I
raised the right children. Oh, well, no, you were horrified. But
no, I was amazed. I was amazed.
Okay,
I'm
right.
like, what a self-sacrificial statement.
Okay,
I'm going to serve you with my whole self.
Yes.
So that was kind of our picture, but it wasn't limitless. Like we would say, the religious traditions have very often recognized that divorce was permissible or maybe necessary in cases of adultery. There also used to be recognitions for like extreme cruelty, what we would call abuse. Civilly, we've also recognized that abandonment or addiction were grounds for divorce. And that makes a lot of sense.
And just to clarify, because your focus is so much on children,
right.
Is it salient whether or not the couple have children?
So
like if you've got a couple who don't have children and have no anticipation of having children, should the rules for divorce be different?
So personally, I'm like, in my opinion, I'm like, I don't think it's good for you necessarily to just make an easy exit, because the truth is you'll probably recreate the same problems in your next marriage. Very often it's not them, it's you. But I'm like, you're not harming kids if you exit. But then when you structurally decide that all of America, for example, is going to have a no-fault divorce system, which we do, which is anybody can exit the marriage for any reason at any time and you'll never see it coming, that actually does have an impact on how everybody else looks at marriage. Because when you can exit easily, you sometimes enter easily, right? Or when there's a more sort of a casual approach to marriage, like, oh, it's just a vehicle of adult fulfillment, which is what no-fault divorce communicated to adults. Like, this no longer is about the kids.
Katy, it doesn't seem to me that places which allow divorce more exhibit more couples just randomly getting married for no reason. In fact, marriage rates are lowest in the countries where divorce is easiest, and marriage seems to be more universal and more easily embarked upon in cultures where divorce is much harder.
It's interesting because higher expectations, right, more rigid requirements actually does elevate behavior. And so we see that places that have instituted, for a while we had states that had no-fault divorce and at-fault divorce. And the states that had no-fault divorce, where you could easily exit, their marriage rates declined. Because you're like, well, what is this even for?
Weren't you just saying a moment ago that people will have less respect for marriage and they'll just get into marriages more randomly?
Yeah, they might easily get in and easily get out, or they'll say, what's the point?
But they don't more easily get in. They get in at lower rates.
The other response is, what's the point? There's nothing special about this.
I see.
Right?
So you mean they might just walk away from marriage altogether?
That's exactly
because
right.
It
Hook
just
up,
seems trivial.
shack up. Yeah, right. There's no difference. So your question was like, can you have one spouse, a couple that doesn't have kids is okay for them?
Yeah,
to
you could
divorce?
imagine a parallel system, right, where you have like, you're allowed to get married, and if you get married, then you're allowed to divorce for no reason. If you want to have kids, then from the moment you get pregnant, your marriage vows essentially change,
Yep.
and you know, there's a switch that gets flicked, and then it has to be at fault.
So then you can say, okay, if you are going to go through a divorce, so there are some states, for example, I'm not sure what's happening in Australia, but there's all kinds of people that are working to try to undo the harm of divorce, even though there's no state that I know right now that is genuinely considering reversing no-fault divorce. There's all kinds of efforts like, okay, well, if you have kids, can we require a 6-month waiting period? Well, if you have kids, before you can get a divorce, you're going to have to go through all of these training sessions so that you can understand how it's going to impact your children's physical health, mental health, emotional health, academic health, relational health. We're going to show you that this is actually going to hurt your kids. We're going to do whatever we can to throw up some roadblocks. And so can you have a system where there's a divorce law for people with kids and a divorce law for people without? No, because the thing about marriage and family law is there's a constellation, right? Everything kind of moves together. The definition of parenthood, the definition of marriage, how you establish relationships with one another, and how you bring those children in, like adoption requirements, like all of that is like a big solar system that works together. So you can't say, for example, with IVF, you can't necessarily say, well, we want IVF, which I'm highly critical of IVF, as you probably have picked up, for everybody. You can't just say, well, we're going to permit IVF in certain cases where it's only the husbands and wives' gametes and only a certain number of embryos, and we're not going to destroy anything. There's some countries in Europe that have tried that, but it's very, very difficult to do. You can't say, we're going to open the door for just this kind of permissiveness for adults in divorce or IVF without saying we're going to restructure the entire constellation of marriage, family, parenthood, all of that.
Why is it so hard? Is that just because then people will say, well, you're discriminating against me and you're depriving me of this right that other people have?
Right. Because marriage and family go together. Because marriage and parenthood are married at the hip. Why? Because these things have historically always gone together. Marriage and children are a package deal. And our laws are structured that way.
Just on the divorce question before we leave divorce, suppose you had a woman with biological children and she gets married to a stepfather who's not the biological father of those kids. That marriage doesn't work, and she wants to reunite with the children's biological father, and she wants to divorce that guy and get together with, so now you've got two conflicting priorities that you care about. You want children to have biological mother and a biological father, but you also want marriages to stay together. Do you oppose the divorce of the biological mother from the stepfather?
It's interesting to me because very, very often when I talk about who children are, what they need, the ideals, people do what you're doing right now, which is they'll appeal to these extreme edge cases, these massive exceptions. So you've just appealed to several.
But you understand why we do that, right?
Because
in philosophy, you do that because in order to tease out what's true and what's not, you need to sort of push it to the edge. Like,
that we call them edge cases. That's what we call it. Edge
why
cases.
is murder bad? Well, what if Anne Frank was is lying bad? What if Anne Frank was in your attic? Would you lie to the Nazis? Or you pull out those things in order to try to understand the contours of the argument, not as some kind of brilliant gotcha because you think that it's going to happen all the time.
Well, so I would say I would be happy to entertain that edge case, but should we first establish the rule? And would you be willing to concede that the rule is that based on social science, natural law, I would say what is self-evident, that children benefit from and deserve and are made for a relationship with their own mother and father unless there's extenuating circumstances or crises that prevent them from having it.
No, I wouldn't concede that rule, but that's your rule. So I'm just teasing out whether or not your rule is consistent.
Yeah. Well, I would say that we know based on mountains of social science data that biological parents are statistically the most connected to, invested in, and protective of children. And you can measure that in a lot of different ways.
Yes,
and you and I can work on that. But I would say I'll answer your edge case on the understanding that it's an edge case. And you're appealing to like a stepfather situation, which the rule about step parents is that they are less connected to, invested in, and protective of children. And that is objectively measurable. I'm not saying there are not heroic step parents. There are. There 100% are.
No, I'm with you on that because there's data on it. Yeah.
Yes. So now you're saying we'll create this case where, mom marries stepfather. They want to go through a divorce. That's going to create some instability for the children. But then she's going to return to the biological father, and then they're going to get married. Also, another transition. Transitions can introduce stress to children. They can be higher stress. But I would say in that situation, the children probably want that scenario anyway. There was a study that was done in, I'd say 2018, where this idea of kind of any two will do. Well, as long as children have two loving parents, or as long as they have a mother and a father figure, they're going to be fine. But the study in the UK found that children who were raised by a lone mother up until the time they were 8 fared about as well as children who were raised by a mother who had remarried a stepfather. But if the mother married the child's own biological father at age 8, they tended to rebound and match the level of overall thriving as children whose parents had always been married. So there is something beneficial about the mom marrying the biological father of the children. Throw divorce in there and, there's some complexities in terms of transition and instability.
Right.
Yeah, but...
So, I mean, the reason I'm asking in Ed case is because it's interesting to hear the language that you use to justify your reasoning as you're going through
sure.
your head. And what I hear you're talking about well-being, right? So avoiding instability for the child, what is in the best interests of the child. And you also mentioned that the child might want it. In other words, the child has some agency, right? So you're appealing not so much to, in that case at least, to rights, to natural rights. You're talking about what is best for the child, what is in the child's best interest, and how can we give some credence to what the child themselves actually wants, which I think is a place where we're likely to get closer than by talking in esoteric ways about what the natural rights of the child are, right? So why is it not in the interests of let me first concede, step-parents are disproportionately violent towards children, especially male step-parents, unfortunately. Obviously, losing a biological parent who you have a connection with is terrible, and that's a trauma, so that affects the child's well-being.
So the way that you couch that is biological parent who you have a relationship with.
Yeah, that was intentional.
Right.
Yeah. And the dissolution of families is bad. And ideally, we know there's a lot of data also that single-parent households fare worse than two-parent households. So then the question is going to come down to, obviously, whether or not the biological link between a biological parent and a child, not whether or not it's salient, I suspect it probably is, but whether it's orders of magnitude more salient than all of the other factors that go into the well-being of a child. Why is that so important to you?
Why is it important to you? Aren't you the biological father of your children?
Yes.
Why does that matter to you?
It actually doesn't.
Really?
Yeah.
Then why didn't you go get a sperm donor?
Oh, I mean, why not have a connection? Why not have some kind of a genetic lineage if you can? So yes, you're right. It matters it matters enough that I'm not going to go and pay money and go through the logistical and bureaucratic hassle of not doing it if I can just jerk off into a jar. I mean, you know what I mean? But put it this way, if it were the case that I found out that, my mother had an affair and my biological father was not, in fact, my father, that would be shocking, head-spinning, weird for 3 weeks. And then I'd be like, who cares really? Like, he was my dad.
Some donor-conceived children feel that way. Like, wow, this guy raised me for 25 years, and he wasn't even my biological father. What a guy. And some of them are plunged into an identity crisis because they're like, oh my gosh, I learned German because I thought my family was German, but I'm not. Who am I? And overall, what we see for children created through sperm and egg donation and adoption is it's very hard for children to answer the question, who am I? If they can't answer the question, whose am I? So it does end up being pretty important. It's one of the reasons why...
doesn't it depend how you talk to them about it? I mean,
some of it
children
does.
have weird questions about all kinds of things, and it reminds me a little bit like I was in Cuba, and there was this guy who was sort of showing us around. He was like, it wasn't with my family, I was just with my friends, and he was going on and on about gay people this and gay people that, and he didn't know that I was gay. And one of my friends sort of just called him on it at one point because he's this traditional, very masculine, like Latino guy who has very, traditional, what I would regard as retrograde ideas about about sexuality. And when my friend pushed, his final thing was like, what am I going to tell my children? What am I going to tell my children? They see two men kissing in the street. What am I going to tell them? And my friend was like, just be more fucking creative. Figure out what you're going to tell them. You say some people love some people the same sex, some people love some people the other sex. This is something that I'm going to deal with my kids. Why we've got 2 daddies and 2 mummies. I can imagine it being an existential crisis for some people, especially if the people around them are ill-equipped to have that conversation. But there are lots of things that kids, why am I fat? Why have I got curly hair?
Mm-hmm.
Why do I have, what's going on with my breasts? What's happening here? What's happening there? Like, why do people do this? Why are there wars? There's lots of complicated questions that children ask. It's up to us as grown-ups to help them figure out the world. And I don't see that the answer to the question of why do I have 2 dads is massively more complicated than any other harebrained question that a child comes up with. It depends on the situation, but in our case, that, so-and-so is your beloved person who is this and she is that. And we are, it's a little bit more complicated, but families are families and you're loved. Will that lead, can I certainly say that won't lead to an existential crisis where they are racked by, some psychological downside for not having grown up with a female in the household? I can't say that for sure, but there are lots of things that we can't say for sure about the well-being of children.
There's one thing we can say for sure about children. Every single one of them comes from a man and woman. 100% of them. There's no edge cases for that. And we've studied family structure enough to know that when they grow up without one or the other, there's a deficit. I'm not saying that you can't overcome. Children overcome and have to grapple with all kinds of deficits in their childhood. But that is one thing where there's no edge cases. 100% of the time, you guys had to find somebody to give you 50% of the genetic identity for your children.
Yes.
I understand it was a close relative.
Yeah.
Which I think is also interesting. Why? Why did you choose a relative of Sean's, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Why not?
I think the answer is because there's something really special about having a genetic connection to your children. And I think that you recognize it. You probably also, Sean probably wanted some kind of biological connection too.
Yeah, it's lovely.
Because it's wonderful.
It is. It's lovely. It's also, vastly expensive and complicated not to, right? So it's like, I think what you're pointing to there would probably be a more powerful argument if my sperm donation and the involvement of this close family member in donating her eggs were the more difficult and expensive option that we had opted for.
Mm-hmm.
But those are actually the free, easy option.
Mm-hmm.
And we would have had to go an extra mile to avoid having a genetic connection with our children. I'm not saying that it's not nice, but had we had to do that, if I was infertile and if we didn't have a close female family member, and we'd had to go through, a more, I guess, distant form of IVF, then would my relationship with my children be less close, and would it be worse for the children? Like, I'm not quite sure I see the mechanism by which the children are harmed in that scenario versus the scenario that they've got.
I think the point that I'm making is, in the world of reproductive technologies, we recognize that biology matters when the adults want it to. So like right now, there's 2 big cases in Australia, an IVF company called Monash, I think.
Monash?
Monash.
Yeah, that's a university in Melbourne who does
IVF.
Some of that work, yeah.
So they're having this big crisis because they've now had 2 IVF mix-ups.
Yes.
Right, where people have gone home with the wrong children.
Yeah.
But the thing is that people go home with unrelated children all the time in IVF. Sometimes you will purchase egg, you'll purchase sperm, maybe you'll get an entire donor embryo. And that's fine as long as the adults want it that way. So the problem is that biology matters. In the world of big fertility, biology matters when the adults want it to. So biology matters, if the adults are like, this is the child I want, my sperm, I want the egg of this known donor or whatever. The thing is that biology matters to children too. And we tend to understand that when we look at it from the perspective of the adults. Well, of course you want your own genetic child. Well, of course you're upset that you got the wrong embryo. But it matters to kids too. It matters for the sake of their biological identity. Like, children do want to know, who's my mother? Where did I come from? That's one of the reasons why in the world of adoption in the United States, we have absolutely overhauled adoption best practice. Whereas in the 60s and 70s, we had overwhelmingly closed adoptions where people were like, you don't need to know the identity of your poor single mother, unwed mother. we don't even need to tell you that you're adopted. You're being raised by this wealthy heterosexual white couple, and you're doing fine. To now, 95% of adoptions in the United States are open adoptions because social workers recognize that even if they can't be raised by them, children benefit from as many connections with their first family as possible, because there's something about those two adults that they give children something that their unrelated adoptive parents can give them. And I'm saying this as an adoptive mom, right? There are things that I can't fully compensate for that my son has lost. So I guess I just want to make the point that biology matters. It matters to children. And right now we're just talking about biological identity. We can get into the risks of unrelated adults parenting children as well. But in terms of that, biology matters. I mean, you're like, well, kids have all kinds of questions on why am I obese? Like I have ADHD or whatever. But let me ask you this, because I don't think that this is, who is my mother is not at the same level of why do I have dyslexia? So let me ask you, like, can you think of great movies or novels or works of art where children go on a search for their long lost uncle or mother's girlfriend?
No, but you're asking too much of your opponent's arguments there, because I don't think that any reasonable person would say that it's not meaningful to have a connection to a parent. Like that
to their biological parent, because isn't that the argument that you're making, is that it's not important to have a relationship with your biological parent?
Well, I think there are a lot of things that are being smuggled in here. So the adoptive, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. Like there were similar changes here in Australia as to in the United States about open adoptions, right? Yeah. And one of my friends is their parents, it turned out, had been a sperm donor when he was in high school or university or whatever, and his biological daughter tracked him down when the laws changed. Like for the first 25 years of her life or something, she wasn't allowed to find out. Then they changed the policy. She reached out. It was a mutual thing. You were able to, the parent could go onto a register. The child could go onto a register.
You guys did a really good job with that in terms of Australia having like rights. I would say like they're crumbs, but they are rights for donor-conceived people to know the identity of the person that created them.
And we also don't
18.
have commercial surrogacy here, which you do in the States. You can't pay people for, I mean, you can reimburse them, but you can't pay a fee for surrogacy. And we'll get to that, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And so what I've seen is this beautiful kind of flowering and flourishing of a wider family, where you've got the original nuclear family, and then you've got this adopted child who had a great family of her own, and now you've got two families where there's an enormous amount of love. So the quest for the biological parent specifically, right? Yes, it's ingrained. It's like it's innate. I mean, there is something fundamental and primal and mammalian.
Right. I think primal is the right way to put it.
Right, about one's lineage. I mean, one of the reasons why we're tribal is also because we feel like we belong. There's a sense of like heritage. There's a sense of coming from somewhere. There's a sense of place, and there's a sense of belonging, and all of that is emotionally tied up in our sense of what our biological parentage is. And I'll grant you all that. The question comes with the next move that you make, which I think is to say that primacy is so fundamental that it's worth trampling over what I would regard as a lot of other public goods and rights in order to enshrine it. Well, a society in which people can flourish and create more families and more love that have different kinds of shapes, right? That a society in which children who are up for adoption aren't robbed of the capacity to have a loving family because there are such strict rules about whether or not they can be adopted by same-sex parents. A society in which, gay people have to have their desire for family thwarted because of the imagined natural rights of children who statistics show would be just as well adjusted or more so in that family.
Tell me about those statistics.
Well, we can get into these statistics because I know you dispute them, but there's a lot of them. Let's talk about what's bad for kids, and then I'll talk to you about the statistics, okay?
Can I just circle back and say, I just want to make the point that this idea of who are my parents, where do I come from, it is primal. And I think that you said it exactly right. And it is reflected in all of historically great art, great literature, great movie. You have endless stories of children seeking their long-lost father because there's something that only that man can give to them. that even a loving heterosexual adoptive parent cannot give to them. And I think that we diminish that to the deficit of children and all of society. And we do it intentionally because we want adults to be able to forge whatever kind of romantic or familial bonds that they want, even if it means that the children are going to suffer in some way. So I don't mean to be rude, but if I'm doing my job, I feel so called to accurately represent the child's perspective, because they can't sit in on podcasts and they can't file amicus briefs. They can't advocate for their own rights. And you are being so gloriously charitable and curious. And so I really appreciate that. So I don't mean to sound like obstinate or combative or anything, but I'm not going to be doing what I'm supposed to be doing if I'm not really identifying these non-negotiables of what it means to be a human child. So thank you for letting me make that point.
No, absolutely. I mean, bring it. It's called Uncomfortable Conversations for a reason.
Okay.
What's bad for kids, right? What's bad for kids? An abusive parent.
Yes.
A broken home. Poverty is pretty bad for
Define
kids.
broken home.
Oh, a home in which there is conflict between the parents and one of them leaves.
Okay, so broken home is a home where what's broken?
The structure of the nuclear family.
What's a nuclear family? 2
parents and kids.
Okay. Why is it just 2?
Because, I mean, why not 2? Wouldn't you have to make a case for it not to be 2?
You would. But why are you defining it as 2? What makes 2 so important?
I think it's probably we've probably inherited that from culture and biology.
So it could be 4. That could be a nuclear family? 4 parents?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
Okay. Why? Like, so you just said a nuclear family is important. So why?
Tribally, it was more than 2. I mean, traditionally in lots of traditional societies, you would have, the old maxim that it takes a village, right? And you would have a much more collective approach to raising children. Maybe grandparents would be the primary carers while the parents were off doing other things.
Do you think that's different than a 4-parent home?
Well, I mean, I think if by 4-parent home you're invoking an idea of kind of purple-haired, like polyamorous, communities, where then I think we're injecting a sort of whole set of other things that we might disapprove of. Like,
what about 1 man and 3 wives? 1 man, 3 wives practiced widely in the Islamic world. Nuclear family?
Well, now aren't we just quibbling over language? Isn't this semantic at this point?
Well, who said if you're not arguing about words, what's the point of arguing? I mean, like, everything is about the words that we're using, because words are giving shape to truths. And I want to make sure that we're talking about the things that really are true, because you're using...
I want to make sure that we're focusing on what you claim to be focusing on, which is the well-being of children.
Yes.
So is it possible for in a Muslim family where there's a husband and 3 wives, it is highly likely that there are all kinds of other extraneous things that are going on that are deleterious to the well-being of the child. It's probably misogynistic. It's probably sexist. It's probably dysfunctional in ways that I would regard as dysfunctional, but maybe more religiously traditional people like yourself might actually regard as being fine. In terms of having
Did you just say that because I'm a crazy Bible thumper that I love polygamy? Because this is about to get really spicy.
Not polygamy, but a more traditional patriarchal structure in the nuclear family.
I love you, patriarchy. That's for you. That's for your Substack.
Okay. So my focus is on what is good and bad for children, and my worry is that you use the pretext of that focus to actually smuggle in a whole bunch of other things that you just like because
because I'm a bigot.
Not a bigot. No, I don't think you are a bigot. I'd be very surprised if you were.
Because I'm an undercover agent for a religious takeover of Australia and all the West.
Everyone is allowed to have their moral and traditional preconceptions, and you're open about the fact that you're a deeply Christian person, and so you have certain ideas about the way that the world should be ordered, and the easiest way to embark upon those ideas
is to do it in the name of what's best for the kids.
Well, exactly. I mean, this is not I'm not saying you're being cynical about it, but I'm just saying that instinct can often, through, whether you go back to violent video games or McCarthyism against communism or whatever it is, there's a long tradition of people saying, but think about the children in order to as a way of kind of reinforcing their own prior existing worldview about the way that things should be ordered.
Do you think you and Sean have done that?
No.
You don't think
I'm pretty careful.
You don't think that you've taken your worldview that love makes a family, that families come in lots of different shapes, as I think you said, and then you have said, therefore, we are going to decide that the best interest of the child aligns with our previous ideas that two men can offer the same thing to children as their own biological married mother and father.
Well, in that extremely narrow respect we have, but if you're using it in that term, then all of us our entire lives are just a litany of imposing our own preconceptions on the world.
Mm-hmm.
All we're doing is living our lives and using data and common sense to figure out what is likely to be...
Did you say data?
Yeah, sorry, data.
Great. Sorry about that. Obviously need to be on the ground a little more before I jump in.
The other tricky thing about Australians...
So you just said what you're saying. I just want to recap.
Yeah.
You're saying you're using data and common sense to create a family. Or your family reflects data and common sense. Is that what you're saying?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes. So, if there was research, I guess we have to get into sort of like the data and the stats here, right?
Thank you. I mean, obviously, I got to have all kinds of help here.
The other tricky thing about Australia, the Australian accent, just as an aside, is that we do this weird thing where when a word ends in a vowel and the next word begins in a vowel, we put a linking R in. Mm-hmm. So we would say like data and instead of data and, or like China and Japan or something. Anyway, so if there was a body of research that said that children fared more poorly in same-sex couples than in straight couples, then I would have absolutely given it pause. So to that extent, it's based on data.
What kind of data? I assume you're very thoughtful, very educated, you're a journalist. What is your sense of the data when it comes to research on same-sex headed households?
Well, I'm glad you asked. I don't normally bring notes.
Okay.
But I did ask someone who I know who works in this field.
Great.
Who's not a crazy, LGBTQI activist, but so 2023, BMJ Global Health. The paper was called Family Outcome Disparities Between Sexual, Minority, and Heterosexual Families, a Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis.
Was that the Italian?
That's Zhang, Wang, Wang, Zhu, Tan, Tian. So I'm guessing not Italian.
Okay.
A weird cluster of Italians.
Sorry,
no significant differences in physical health or education.
Is this the one that
outcomes.
Is this the sort of overview of a variety of different...
It says systematic review and meta-analysis, so that would be a meta. Yeah.
Okay.
2020, Maresky, DeWitt, and Caboo in the American Sociological Review called School Outcomes of Children Raised by Same-Sex Parents, Evidence from Administrative Panel Data.
Is that the one? Is that Netherlands? Is that the Scandinavian
No,
study?
that's not the Scandinavian one, I don't think, because I've got that one as well. Okay. Children raised by same-sex parents perform better in school compared to those raised by different sex parents.
Sorry, what study was that? Is that the Netherlands one?
That's American Sociological Review.
Oh, okay.
In 2020. 2016 study in Pediatrics, the journal, children of same-sex parents are just as healthy and well-adjusted as those of heterosexual parents. Mm-hmm. The American Psychological Association, the Australian Psychological Association, and the Canadian Psychological Association have all independently concluded that children's well-being does not vary based on parents' sexual orientation. The 2017 study by Farr, entitled Does Parental Sexual Orientation Matter? A longitudinal follow-up of adoptive families with school-aged children in the Journal of Developmental Psychology. The Journal of Child Development by Patterson, Children of Lesbian and Gay Parents. There's another study from 2022 that compared children aged 6 to 16 with same-sex parents to their peers with different sex parents, which found no significant differences in areas like social adjustment, emotional adjustment, or general behavioral problems. The University of Melbourne in 2014, that's going back, found that children of same-sex parents scored higher on measures of general health and family cohesion compared to the general population. In Pediatrics Journal in 2020, a review concluded that children of same-sex parents are just as healthy and well-adjusted as those of heterosexual parents. There's the Pew Research Center study in 2025. And so do you want to just tell me why all those are wrong?
Mm-hmm. Some of them are distinct studies, and some of them are capturing, some of them are recaps of Okay, let me go back. Up until about 2005, there was a consensus in the sociological world that children fared best when they were raised by their married, biological mother and father in a low-conflict marriage. That is what everybody on the left and the right would say until 2005. Why? Because if you look at data and common sense, obviously, the two people responsible for the existence of the child are going to be the most connected to, invested in, and protective of them. You can look at that from an evolutionary perspective.
Usually.
100%. I'll grant you some edge cases. Edge cases where...
I mean, some people give up their child.
Yes, some people abuse... But some
people
biological people abuse their children.
Yeah.
Horrible. Okay. So, but on the whole, when you look at kind of the pantheon of human relationships, married, biological, mother and father in a low-conflict relationship. That was the consensus among all sociologists.
And where and in what circumstances are we taking children out of that environment to put them into same-sex households?
Well, I'd say culturally, legally, and technologically, we've absolutely overhauled things to do exactly that. But we can get to that after we test the data.
There is no universe in which children who would otherwise be brought up in a heterosexual family with biological parents are not getting that,
because
they're getting something else.
Because we've created systems where we can design and purchase and legally extract children from their genetic mother or father through the combination of reproductive technologies and overhauling our parenthood laws.
Only when that mother and father were not going to raise that child.
Sure. So we've said it's okay to sell your children, and I actually don't think that that's reflection of the best
we can talk about the commercial side of things,
right?
But that's a distinct question from here is this ideal family,
we're creating
and we're not
systems.
giving the children that ideal family.
Sure.
There is no universe in which the children who were going to have that ideal family are being taken away and raised by same-sex families or
okay. That's one way to think about it. The other way is we are now manufacturing and in some places incentivizing the creation of motherless or fatherless children. Do you think that's true? That we have created systems that incentivize or permit people to create motherless or fatherless children?
Yes, it depends on you. If your strict definition of mother and father is the biological, the person who produced the sperm and the person who produced the egg, then that's undeniably true.
Yes. And I would say mothers and fathers are more than that, but they're not less than that. So let's talk about the data. So something happened around 2005, especially in the United States, where suddenly you had this entire consensus that was data-driven and common sense, right? That these two adults, and you can look at it from an evolutionary perspective. Obviously, if you are making a baby, there is an interest in investing in your own genetic offspring versus investing in a child who's not biologically yours. There you get a lot of the...
Hence the higher rates of violence from step-parents.
Right. There's an entire... there's a name for that phenomenon. It's called the Cinderella effect, that an adult who's raising a baby who's not theirs or a child who is not theirs is going to have lower levels of investment, protection, and connection with them. So this is what I would call self-evident, right? Whether you're looking at it from a biblical perspective or an evolutionary perspective. But then something changed in 2005. And from 2005 until 2015, conveniently, when we had Obergefell, that legalized gay marriage, suddenly there was this bizarre new consensus that actually biology wasn't relevant and mothers and fathers didn't matter. And it was okay if there was some kind of traumatic loss of the mother or father due to divorce or death or abandonment or reproductive technologies. And so that's where you're getting all of those studies. Some of them are actually distinct and unique. Like the one in the Netherlands, I think was a good study, the one that showed higher levels of academic...
I didn't actually raise the Netherlands one yet.
Okay, I think that one's good.
I wanted to make sure that I could address one point that I know that you make, which is a legitimate one in criticizing some of these things, which is that they're not randomized. Some of them are self-selecting, right? So, of course, if you go out into the field and you go, hey, we want to talk to a whole bunch of happy same-sex families about how great it is to have same-sex parents, and then you say, look, they're all great, then, of course, you're missing the ones who aren't. So that's a problem. I mean, that's a methodological problem. Some studies have tried to get around that by making it randomized. It's difficult to do randomized studies of this because it's a fairly small cohort of the population, so it's hard to get a whole bird's eye view, but some places have done it. So then there's the Dutch one that you're talking about in 2020. This is the American Sociological Review. They reported on this administrative data from the Netherlands. So the Netherlands basically just took the entire population instead of self-selecting.
And that's the way you need to do it. You've got to do the government data.
Yeah. And so we did it.
Yep.
At least in the Dutch case. And they compared children from same-sex families to children from different sex families and found that the kids in same-sex parent families performed better in school, and they even adjusted for socioeconomic factors to make sure that there wasn't a skew in the data, which I think is actually a little bit unfair. I'm not sure you should adjust for socioeconomic factors because, you might say, well, how could it be the case that children of same-sex families do better than, like, how can it be better to not have a biological mother or a biological father?
That's a great mystery.
It's not that much of a mystery because you're self-selecting for people who really, really, really wanted kids and didn't accidentally have children. Invested a huge amount of resources in getting those children. So it isn't, and they had, and they're middle class or upper class, and they have the resources to be able to bring those children into existence. So it doesn't strike me as crazy that if a cohort of people have resources and commitment, that the children are going to have better outcomes than the random population where a 16-year-old can get knocked up in the back of a car at a drive-in and wham, bam, you've got a family. There's a 2010 study published in Demography Journal that used a big nationally representative data set to analyze the educational outcomes of children raised by same-sex couples. And I haven't jotted that down, but it's Demography Journal 2010, so we can look it up. That found that children had comparable educational outcomes to children with different sex parents. And the last big randomized one that I could find was in Population Research and Policy Review. A comprehensive review found no significant differences in various aspects of child well-being, including academic performance and psychological health. Now, I want to grant you that none of this says that there isn't something lost when you don't have a connection to a biological mother and a biological father, right? It just says that whatever that loss is a signal, is a sort of a noise that's drowned out by the signal of all of the other factors that go into having a flourishing childhood.
So the reason why I'm asking which studies these are is because if you actually were culling studies that used the gold standard of social science, it wouldn't just be randomized participants. It would be large sample studies with adequate control groups. It would be longitudinal over a long period of time.
Well, one of them is, the Dutch one is.
The Dutch one is, which is why it's worth looking at.
And it still doesn't show what you're trying to show.
In terms of what do you mean?
Like a deleterious effect for children.
Yeah. So with that one, you probably can say, in fact, because I asked two different sociologists about that, like what's going on with the Dutch study. And they said very clearly it's wealthier lesbians. And when you are going to the marketplace of sperm and egg donor catalogs, you are selecting for different attributes, intelligence, education level. So they do think that there's a genetic aspect of that.
Yeah.
Which is why, you pay a little bit more for a Yale egg donor than you do for a Washington State egg donor, because it's true, right? People are recognizing this is part of building the designer baby. So if you were only to have brought me studies that use the gold standard of social science research, we'd be talking about 4 or 5. That's it.
All of which would still prove my point.
No. Because you didn't mention Regnerus and you didn't mention Dr. Sullins, who's currently at the Catholic University of America, and he looked at government data and examined different aspects, especially emotional aspects of children raised by same-sex parents.
And what did that find?
Higher rates of emotional distress, daily fearfulness and crying increased. Regnerus was the first guy to do this using the gold standard. And here's the other big thing. Most of those studies, because, as you said, very hard to find these families. Like it's only 10% of LGBT couples in the United States are married and a small percentage of them have children. So it's very hard to find these couples at random.
One thing that surprised me was that a lot of these studies go back a long time because long before marriage, same-sex couples were having kids informally, mainly lesbians, right? Because they can biologically. It's a lot easier.
Well, or most of the kids who are 30, 40, 50 who have an LGBT parent are the product of a heterosexual relationship that broke up, which a lot of so then that's the explanation. If then there is confounding, right? Yeah, if there is some kind of damaging effect or diminished outcomes, it was the heterosexual breakup that did it, not the same-sex parenting. So the other big problem with most of these studies is they don't wait for the kids to grow up. They don't wait and ask the child who's 19 or 29, were you on welfare? Did you experience any kind of abuse? Were you connected to your parent? What were you on an IEP, or did you have most of them will go, if you go back and look at those studies, which I'm glad you mentioned the names because I want people to go back and look it up. Go back and look at the methods. They did not evaluate the children's how many of them were on medications when they were young. They went to the parents and said, how does your kid like having gay parents? Like, are they doing well? Do they feel are you connected to them? Are they connected to you? Are they doing well in school? Are they successful? Are they depressed? And so really what you're getting is the adult's idea of how the children are faring. That's not nothing, but it also is not the kind of data that should override what.
That's not true in most of those studies. They're not interviews with the parents.
Are you sure?
Yeah. I mean,
how are you going to do that then if you're evaluating a child who's 6 or 8 years old?
By looking at their school reports.
So that's what the Dutch study did, which was great.
Yeah, and looking at their medical records and seeing whether or not they're being, diagnosed with things.
Most researchers didn't do that. So I'm just saying, like, when I have these
you suspect that when that does happen, we will find a narrative that contradicts the mainstream narrative about the well-being of children of same-sex households.
This is the bizarre thing about the family structure debate. Whenever you're not talking about same-sex parents, anytime if you're not studying same-sex parents, sociologists agree that biological parents advantage children in terms of they invest more money, they spend more time. The children report feeling more connected to the biological parent. Whenever you're not studying same-sex parenting, there is a consensus that fathers offer distinct benefits to children, that mothers do things different than fathers do. Whenever you're not talking about same-sex parents and you just study children created through sperm or egg donation raised by heterosexual couples, you see that those kids do tend to struggle with identity issues. They have higher levels of family fragmentation. For example, the biggest study that was ever done on this that compared sperm donor kids to adopted kids to children raised by their own married biological mother and father was called My Daddy's Name is Donor. And it showed that and it was a big sample size, and it actually interviewed the children themselves. It wasn't just self-reporting of adults. It found that those kids suffered. They had diminished outcomes. So what's so strange to me is that when you're not talking about same-sex parenting studies, mothers and fathers do distinct and complementary things that benefit child development, there's a clear agreement that biological parents advantage children and unrelated adults disadvantage children, and that any form of parental loss hinders children and can create some level of primal wound. And for some reason, none of those three things matter when you're talking about same-sex parents. Why do you think that is?
I think you're right to smell a rat. I think you're right to smell a rat in the way that politics and cultural change can influence science. It influences what people get, what you're allowed to do your PhD thesis on. It influences the social environment at what gets published in journals. And you're probably right that in the first decades of this century, there was such an eagerness to try to normalize same-sex marriage and an eagerness to try to equalize the rights of gay people that there was. It was regarded as unseemly to focus too much on those facts, right? So,
in fact, you wouldn't get funded.
Yeah. So there's that.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also worth trying to be specific about why it is that the traditional claim was that a mother and a father who are biologically related to the children is optimal. Because we've mentioned step parents and, higher rates of violence. We've mentioned broken homes, and we went down the rabbit hole about what a nuclear family is, but I think we understand intuitively and just conversationally and rhetorically what we mean by the difference between a broken home and a cohesive home, even if it has a harem of 17 Muslim women. But you mentioned traumatically being robbed of a parent in what you were just saying. And I think a lot of what we intuitively and traditionally have understood to be undesirable about not having a biological mother and a biological father is that to not have a biological mother or a biological father up until 3 seconds ago in technological and cultural time was to have a parent ripped away from you or to have some kind of otherwise dysfunctional scenario that you were being forced to be raised in. So the downsides of living with an alcoholic or abusive or detached step-parent, the downsides of living with only a single parent, the downsides of having your childhood full of turmoil as you get swapped between foster parents and biological parents.
Or two divorced warring parents.
Exactly, that's right. Or, I would say 2 married warring parents who can't get a divorce because they're living in the world that you want to create by having parents who can't divorce each other.
My solution to that is not for them to war. My solution for them is to do the hard thing so they're not at war and their children don't have to live in split homes, split lives, and in 50% of cases develop split personalities. My solution is the adults do the hard thing, not the kids.
I get that.
Keep going.
Yes, no, I understand that you're not being facetious. But so all of what I think has happened is that 3 seconds ago, we found a technological and scientific solution that is offensive to religious people because it is playing God to some extent, in which we can essentially decouple the biological fact of the heritage of a child, not a child, but like a zygote, from all of the other downsides of the kind of traumatic broken home phenomenon that you're talking about. This is not to say that there's no downside to my children having two dads. Fine, there may be, I don't know. But it is to say that I think a lot of your concerns are piggybacking on downsides that are no longer relevant because they're associated with a whole bunch of other dysfunctions that existed prior to the invention of gay marriage, IVF, and surrogacy.
So you are right. We now have a technological workaround that allows us to manipulate children in ways that the biological, our human bodies don't, especially as it relates to motherhood. So in the past, there was no way to separate genetic mother from birth mother. In 100% of cases, they were the same woman. But now we have the technological ability to not bifurcate, but trifurcate mothers into 3 different roles, right? You've got, when most of us think of our mother, we look back and we say, well, she was the woman that gave me my green eyes. She is the woman that, gave me my Irish heritage. And my chin looks just like her. And I cough the same way. Okay. Like that is the sweetness that you probably see in your children, that they kind of look like you, that they might have the same kind of like hitch in their voice when they speak. And it's sweet and it's wonderful. And it's important to you and it's important to your kids too. So you've got the genetic mother, but then you also have the birth mother, right? The woman that we form that critical bond with for the first 9 months of our life. It is the one who statistically soothes the baby, especially in the first couple hours, days, and weeks of their life in a way that no other person can. So the practice in hospitals, whenever you're not talking about surrogacy, is to immediately place the child on the chest of the birth mother because she is the only thing in the world that the baby knows. Now, that's a really critical bond. And we can talk about adoption and why, even though adopted children are raised by adults who largely are wealthier, better educated, and statistically have more stable marriages, adopted children still struggle overwhelmingly with externalizing disorders, struggle academically. And I would say a lot of that is because they had that primal bond disrupted, even if it was the first day of their life.
Do we have data on whether that depends on what age they were when they were adopted?
So we have data on adoptees who were adopted at birth having longer-term, more externalizing disorders, more anxiety, depression, self-harm, and a lot of that, they would say.
More than people who were adopted when they were conscious, when they were
so then
children.
It's hard to parse out what part of the trauma was. Well, it's hard to know what kind of trauma you're dealing with, right? If you have a revolving door of foster homes, that's a whole nother level of trauma, right?
Yeah.
So we look at those kids and we say, well, it makes sense that maybe they're struggling in school or they have anger issues. But we also see that kind of lower levels of thriving even in children that were adopted at birth. So genetic mother, birth mother, and then the social mother is the woman that provides that daily female love every day that complements sort of the everything of the fathers, the critical aspect of the fathers, but does something really, really different when it comes to nurturing attachment, child development, the way they speak, the way they discipline, the way that they orient the child towards the world or toward others, the one that emphasizes equity and fairness and routine, and dad does really, really different things. So yes, we are now at a place where technologically we can split that woman up into 3. So we're exempting children maybe from the traumas of ripping them away from their mother through a divorce situation or because she's a drug addict. But to me, that's not a common sense approach to making a family. Isn't common sense to align with how the body is naturally designed for mother to be both the genetic and the birth and the social? Doesn't it make sense from a common sense perspective or even an evolutionary perspective that we probably should not split up the primary relationship that all of us have? I would say the only relationship. It is the only relationship that all of us have for the first 9 months of our life. Just because we found a way to technologically tinker, I would say, to satisfy what adults want. Do you really think that that's in the best interest of children?
Well, you're speaking as if there's a universe in which the child has the option of having a biological mother and a biological father and a happy, stable, prosperous home.
The child doesn't have that option
child,
because the adults are purchasing and designing.
Well, the child doesn't have that option because that child wouldn't be brought into existence were it not for the fact that it was being brought into a scenario that doesn't have that biological parent. So it strikes me that you're creating a false binary, right? That you're saying, here's the ideal. Why wouldn't we opt for the ideal? I'm saying we live in a world in which that ideal is not on the table in the cases that we're talking about.
It's not on the table because an adult doesn't. It's not on the table. So what?
It's not on the table because our surrogate didn't want any more kids.
It's not on
She wasn't going to bring a child into her family.
Yeah.
She had 3 fabulous children. She'd had enough. She was not going to have any more children.
A better way to look at it
We
is...
stepped in and created life who are enjoying a flourishing family. That flourishing family, you can argue, is suboptimal in comparison to the fantasy that you're creating in your brain. That fantasy family wasn't on the cards.
The fantasy family that I'm creating in my brain is the one that has been accepted throughout society, that is except
yes, and none of them are being deprived. We're not preventing the existence of any of those families. Lots of people having sex in the world. They can create all the families they want. It doesn't diminish any one of... there is no net loss of the family that you're talking about when we bring into existence other forms of families.
I'm not talking about saying everybody should... I'm not here to defend the family. I'm here to defend children. I'm here to say that children should not be intentionally motherless and fatherless.
Then your duty would be to prove that there's a harm to the child who's being brought into the world, not to say that it's inferior to a family that child never has had the option of accessing.
There's a harm to the children being brought into the world.
Yes, that it's actually worse for that child.
It's worse for the child.
Yeah. Not worse than for them to have a perfect platonic ideal of a family, but it would be better never to have existed.
So one of the things we do at Them Before Us is we catalog the stories of children who have lost their mother or father. One category of those children are children created through third-party reproduction, sperm or egg donation or surrogacy. And you can imagine that a lot of these kids are faced with if they say, I kind of feel like I wish I had a dad, or, I really would like to know the identity of my biological mother. You can imagine that a lot of these kids here, yeah, but shouldn't you just be grateful to be alive? You wouldn't exist if I had not paid $50,000.
Well, that's not a very tactful way of putting it.
But you can imagine that a lot of these kids have faced that exact objection that, look, you should be grateful. You should be grateful. So to me, I think...
Well, no, you shouldn't say that to a child. I mean, that's a ridiculous thing to say to a child, but I'm not saying it to a child. I'm saying I'm trying to understand how you get from your love of the family in your head
the love of... Yep.
It should be the only model.
I love the structure of married, permanent mother and father because it is the delivery system that we know leads to maximum child thriving. I'm not here to protect this family unit. This is who children are. They are made from a man and woman. They get their identity from that man and woman. Statistically, they're most likely to be thrived when they're raised by that man and woman in a permanent relationship. The family serves the child, not the other way around. So what I think is going on in the world of reproductive technologies, and it's not just same-sex couples. I mean, heterosexuals. We're doing this long, long before gay couples began. So that's why I say this is a perspective that confronts everybody, single, married, gay, straight,
the majority of IVF situations that I know, and I'm sure you as well, and the majority of people who I know who were unable to conceive, so they used a donor egg, for example, but then the mother is the birth mother. far exceed the number of same-sex couples.
100%.
So,
and that's why the GOP in the United States is really struggling with this.
Yeah,
because it's their people.
Yes, because you're more consistent, actually. Because it's harder. Your position is more, I think, ethically and religiously consistent, although I disagree with it, than the claim that there's something uniquely bad about same-sex marriages and parenting. Is it your claim that a straight couple who can't conceive and therefore use an egg donor, but the birth mother is the mother, that those children are at such a disadvantage that they shouldn't have been allowed to do that, to bring those children into the world?
What you're doing when you're using reproductive technologies to create children and intentionally cutting them off from their mother or father is you're actually exploiting a child's vulnerability. The child cannot defend themselves, right? The child cannot defend their life. They cannot defend their relationship with their own mother and father. Because they're at the height of vulnerability and weakness, we exploit them. And we say, because I want something, this heterosexual couple where she, for whatever reason, decided to get pregnant at 44. And now, maybe because she didn't find the right guy, maybe because she put her career first, maybe because she really has...
Maybe she's 24 and she is, she has a condition where she can't conceive without an egg donor.
Edge case, but possible. Very rare for a genuine 24-year-old to have an infertility issue that cannot be solved by seeking to identify and resolve the underlying issue. Most of those things are treatable at the age of 24. So it's much more common for women to turn to IVF because they have bypassed their prime reproductive years.
Yeah, I don't really get the antipathy towards edge cases, because when you construct laws, you have to be mindful of all the cases.
When you construct laws, you have to recognize the rule first, in my opinion, because if you want to create a law based on edge cases,
No. You just have to take into account, it's very important to take into account edge cases when you're crafting a law, because a law that might be great for 90% of people, but you're just spilling water on the couch for people who are just listening.
Had a lot of drinks before I got in here.
It's not trivial to say that if you were constructing a law which was only going to punish people who had been too lazy to bother having children until they were in their 40s, and it also annihilated the ability of a certain number of people in their 20s to have children, then it would be valid to take that into account. I mean, by definition, the people who object to, laws are universal. The laws don't have exceptions unless you write them in. So the whole point of pointing out edge cases is to go, well, is this really just, or does it have unintended consequences that affect, even these edge cases in ways that we find morally untenable?
Totally happy to address the edge cases. But I think that when you say the edge case is going to, so here's something that I've noticed. The victims determine the policy. So we spend an awful lot of time making adults who don't get what they want the victims. And I don't think that that's the way we should go. I think children are the victims, children who don't make it through the IVF process alive, which is about 97% of lab-made babies, children who are intentionally denied their mother or father.
By children, you're talking about 5-day-old blastocysts.
How would you define, when does human life begin?
Well, it's a spectrum, I think.
A spectrum?
Yeah.
At what point? Nail it down.
I can't. And we know that we can't, because this debate has been raging for so long, and obviously both sides are quite strident about their own dogmas. But so it's one of those things where, for me, it's obvious that there is no easy answer.
There's no easy answer, because an easy answer would actually mean that a lot of adults would not get what they want. It's complex.
Well, no, there's no easy answer, because if I present you with a blastocyst the size of a pinhead in a petri dish and a crying baby one day before the 9-month gestation period was up, who was born a day early, you do not relate morally the same way to both of those things. If I threaten to kill one or the other, you will have a preference, which means that you too agree that it is a spectrum.
So biologically, those are both humans. And
they're both members of the species Homo sapiens, I guess, yeah.
They're both stages of human development. And embryologists, there really is not a whole lot of confusion among embryologists that life begins at fertilization. That is when a brand new human is created. The two chromosomes, right, mother and father's Gametes form a brand new human life begins. There's no place where you can then arbitrarily say, that's not a life, but this is a life. You can look at different levels of dependence. You can look at consciousness.
Personhood develop, so I'll grant you that you've got a living entity, but personhood is different from the living entity. And you, whether you claim to or not, you believe that as well, because if I threaten to kill the 8-month and 30-day-old baby or the blastocyst, are you saying you'd have no preference?
Well, I would do whatever I could to rescue whatever child is immediately in front of me. That's for sure. So if
you can't, I'm going to kill one of them.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'll grab whatever I can. And I will grab the screaming baby.
Yeah.
But I don't think that invalidates what I'm saying at all. And
well,
I actually
it implies that you give greater sort of life vitality and right to life to the older baby than you do to the younger baby.
I don't know if it's right to life. I think it's like, what can I immediately do?
Well, let's say it's slightly easier to rescue the blastocyst.
I'll grab both of them. I'm like, so
no, you can only grab one of them.
So let me go back to this. What you're saying is, okay, I'm going to grant.
Sounds like you're dodging the question.
Oh, you're dodging the question. I want to go back to this. You're saying that they're humans, but they're not persons. Okay, so this is actually.
I mean, I'm saying not only do I believe that, but you believe that because you can't answer the question that I just asked.
I said I will get whatever kid that I can. I mean, and what do you like?
That's a dodge.
No. I've lost friends over saying that I don't think that you should eliminate IVF babies. I mean, there is a cost for me to saying, I actually don't think that you, sweet Christian heterosexual couple, should be screening out the undesirables. I don't think you should be grading your embryos. I actually think all of those children are worthy of life. So I haven't had to deal...
just because I was trying to clarify for the listener, because most people would be confused because you're using language in a funny way. That when you're saying children, you're talking about a 5-day-old blastocyst that you can barely see with the naked eye.
That's right.
But if we agree that we're going to call those children, then even though you won't admit that you would treat that ethically exactly the same way as you would another child, which implies to me that you agree that there's a spectrum of sort of rights and a spectrum of personhood throughout gestation. We can continue. We can sort of put that to rest, and you can continue.
You were a blastocyst. When did you become a person?
I said it's a spectrum.
So it's a spectrum because that allows adults to do what they want to do. And I will say that separation...
it's a spectrum because there are things that a baby can feel that a blastocyst can't feel, because there are things that a baby is operating on that a blastocyst isn't. It has a central nervous system.
So once you have a certain amount of feeling, then it's a person.
I mean, I think we all know intuitively that there is a difference between being a fully fledged human being who has, I mean, even between being a newborn baby and having the full rights of a human being.
That's exactly right. Is
a spectrum.
There's a spectrum of dependence, of consciousness. But once you get to the point where you're saying the humanity is separate from personhood, that is the recipe that is the foundation for every genocide, every commodification, right? That is the metric that was used for the Holocaust, for justifying slavery, for justification for genocide, is when you separate human from person. And that is a power play on behalf of those that are in power, that have volition, that have the ability. And I would say that's exactly what's going on in the world of reproductive technologies, and abortion, that you would say, look, it might be human because you're a fool to deny that that is a member of the human species. It is really just the very, very beginning of a lot of different stages of human development. The only difference between you and a blastocyst is time. You also were a blastocyst at one point. But it's, if we can say, but they're not really human. But there really is a distinction, a moral distinction. Katy, here you are. That means that I can create 20 embryos and I can deselect the girls or the boys because I want a specific child. It means that I can go to this bougie fertility clinic in California where 90% of the clientele don't struggle with infertility. They simply want to select the eye color of their baby. And if embryos aren't children, then of course you can do whatever you want with them. So I just think that that's a problem when you're acting like there's nuance and we don't really know. We do know. But knowing and being morally consistent about that means that a lot of adults won't get what they want.
Well, being morally consistent about it would mean that you have to save the blastocyst as much as the 9-month-old child, which you're not willing to do.
Well, I'm willing to lose friends over talking about how I think IVF is...
I admire that. I mean, I admire your moral clarity and certainty and courage. I think we're getting a little bit confused, conflating natural rights with outcomes with like a consequentialist or utilitarian ethic, because when you throw around things like the Holocaust or slavery or so on, many secular philosophers will have reasons for objecting to the Holocaust, right? And those will have to do with human well-being and human flourishing and pain and suffering. You're frowning at me as if this is news to you.
No, I keep talking. I guess I would say that the objection to the Holocaust or the objection to slavery is we degraded and dehumanized an entire group of people, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And why is that bad?
Yes. Why is that bad?
So you could have a sort of a religious kind of almost Kantian sort of attitude to it, which is like you're breaching certain rules, and those are the rules of the cosmos, and those are rules that, you know, are embedded in the very fabric of what it means to be human. And then a consequentialist or a utilitarian could say, rules aside, you're just causing a tremendous amount of pain for people.
Okay.
And you're thwarting their ambitions. And I think what's happening here is that you could imagine a consequentialist or utilitarian case against designer babies. We don't want to live in a society in which the rich tapestry of what it means to be human is flattened out for superficial reasons. This is a debate that's going on, as I'm sure you're aware, in some Scandinavian countries where the abortion of fetuses with Down syndrome has become prevalent. You know, do you want to create a society in which there are no people with Down syndrome, right? The Danes are, you know, struggling with this because they may be about to create a society where there's no people with Down syndrome. Because
Iceland boasts of it.
Right,
Iceland has said,
right.
"Well, we've eliminated Down syndrome." No,
Right.
You just killed all the people with Down syndrome.
Killed all the fetuses with Down syndrome. Yeah. So you could make a case that, like, we don't want to go down. We don't want to start our way down the slippery slope of using trivial reasons to try to jury-rig society and culture and humankind to make it look as blue-eyed and blonde-haired or, you know, athletic as we want it to be, that there's something that we lose about our own humanity when we embark down that path. And to me, that's a separate claim from the claim that the destruction of every blastocyst for any reason is wrong, which strikes me as a more frankly religious claim, which you're perfectly entitled to hold, but unless we live in a theocracy, you're not necessarily entitled to impose on everybody else.
When is it okay to select which children are born? How do you do that? Because you're saying
very tricky.
You're saying it shouldn't be elimination of Down syndrome babies. So why?
Well, I'm not sure that I'm saying that. I honestly don't have an opinion. I mean, I don't know. I'm just saying that they're thorny moral problems that don't have the easy moral answer that I think you think they have.
Well, again, I think that.
But we're not going to litigate that because you're religious, and so it's impervious to reason.
You know, so it's really interesting.
A way. Like, I respect
through
you.
This whole conversation, have I raised any Bible verses or used any kind of religious?
No,
reasoning?
but I just happen to know that you're deeply religious, and so therefore. Right. But you correct me if I'm wrong. I'm assuming that your belief in the sanctity of life from the moment of conception is a religiously derived belief.
Well, I would say that it happens to also be reflected in Scripture, but it's biologically based. So that's the incredible thing about the Word of God, is it reflects the world of God, that you're not going to find a lot of inconsistencies between revealed truth and what we call special revelation, what is revealed in Scripture, and general revelation, what you can see around you based on nature. And so I do think that it is not an accident that those of us who are arguing against designer babies, those of us who are arguing against abortion, also those of us that are arguing against things like doctor-assisted suicide, do happen to come from a religious worldview that says that it's not about utility. It's not about convenience. It's not about what they can add to or detract from society that makes somebody worth defending or worth being born or worth preventing from doctor-assisted death, that there is an innate dignity, that humans are made in the image of God. That imago Dei is the thing that has been the precursor for any level of advancement of human rights. That's not an accident, but it's also reflected in the real life world, that we do think that just because you're not we don't believe in useless eaters, right? We think that people are eaters, and that even if you are somewhat disabled or old or infirm or very young, that it's our job to defend you because you're part of the human species and you are made in the image of God, black or white or young or old or able or disabled. So I can make this case without appealing to Scripture. The fact that Scripture best reflects the principles that lead to human flourishing just makes me love God more.
Got it. So coming back to children, I mean, I also understand, I do appreciate that if the fundamental question that you're pushing for is in the balance of who we give standing to in deciding on whose well-being we ought to prioritize, that we've gotten a bit too skewed towards grown-ups. The children, as you say, they can't file amicus briefs. They can't come on podcasts. There is a tendency for us to give credence to our own preferences and try to universalize them. And we would probably be better off if we tipped the balance a little bit back towards what are in the interests of the children versus what are in the interests of parents. And I would also concede that there's, in the same way that I said that in the first decade or two of this century, it's likely that the push for gay rights steamrolled some concerns for children, that we've lately seen a flowering, shall we say, or a kind of explosion of fairly heedless gender craziness, censoriousness around biology. And I'm sure this is feeding partly into your sense of mission about this sense that there's a big push from the LGBTQIA plus kind of universe and from academia to kind of heedlessly just sort of complicate what it means to raise children, what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a sexual being, what it means to have responsibility, what it means, what the role of the family and the state and the church ought to be. And we ought to be a little bit more mindful of the impact that could have on children. What it comes down to fundamentally is how are we balancing the harms and how are we balancing the upsides? Children are not going to remain children forever. They're going to grow up into adults. Some of them will be gay. Some of them will want to start families. Some of them will be infertile. Some of them will want to access IVF, right? How do you think about that trade-off?
Yep, it's a trade-off. Somebody's going to do the hard thing, right? In all of those scenarios, somebody will do the hard thing. So with the 16-year-old having sex in the back of the car, the oopsie pregnancy or whatever, and then, someone's going to do the hard thing. So what happens in that scenario? Does the child lose their life because the adults participated in a baby-making activity but weren't ready to have a baby? What are the options there? Either that 16-year-old and the 18-year-old guy reorient their life around each other and around the baby. They do the hard thing, or the baby does the hard thing by dying, or by losing a relationship with their mother and father and being relinquished for adoption, which obviously is the lesser of those two options, but still involves loss for the child. So
Well, it may be the lesser of the three options, depending on how badly the 16-year-old and the 18-year-old do as parents.
Well, and that's why I said reorient their lives. It would be a reorientation. You would have to learn to prioritize one another and the child.
And you're confident that everyone will do that at such a large scale, that will be the better of the three options?
Not necessarily confident it would happen at an individual level, but generally throughout history, there have been plenty of people who have gotten married as teenagers or young adults and raised great kids. Because obviously, it is the commitment to one another and to become adults.
I mean, when it does work, it's usually because there's a village. It's usually because there's an extended family, because the grandparents chip in, because,
Love that.
Coming back to the nuclear family question, it's usually because there's an extended family who all chip in and help.
But just to be clear, there's no extended family without the nuclear family. A lot of people say, nuclear family, that's a 1950s U.S. invention. No, nuclear just means sort of the irreducible, like the smallest unit.
Yeah, right.
But obviously, you want a nuclear family surrounded by other aspects of the nuclear family, the aunts, the uncles, the grandparents. 100% absolutely agree with that. Love it. So, but in that scenario, you're kind of saying like, you've got adults that have grown up who had an unplanned pregnancy. So what are you going to do? My answer is the adult sacrifice for the child. Let's talk about the world that I'm in. Lots of Christian, married, heterosexual couples. Marriage is hard. And you get to a point, where you're 7 years in or 12 years in, and you hit those rocky years. And sometimes there's a really big problem. Sometimes he's addicted to porn, or maybe sometimes she's reliving, unearthing some childhood issues and makes her completely unavailable as a mother or a wife for a couple of years. I mean, like, these are not small problems that adults are dealing with. So what do you do? Well, someone's going to sacrifice. Either it will be the adults who go to therapy and have accountability and work it through or grow and mature, or it will be the kids. The kids where, one of them says, I'm out. I've done this too much, or I need to be my true self, or, I need to finally do, put me first. I mean, like, go to Instagram, you'll see like thousands of reels of women who are like, even though there wasn't abuse or anything, I just felt so shackled by, like, screw you, lady. Okay. And so someone's going to do the hard thing. It will be the adult or it will be the child. Those kids grow up and they have same-sex attraction or they identify as gay, and they would be incredible fathers. I bet you and your husband are great fathers. And so there's a choice to be made. Do we form a family where our children lose a mother or two or three, so that we can have the family that reflects our romantic attractions? Or if I desire to become a father or mother, do I create a family where the child doesn't have to lose anything to be in that family? Who is going to do the hard thing?
Which is what?
Which is
marrying a woman.
Yep. Or not having kids. Like,
so
why should the child
You think
lose?
you think that when gay guys, say in the 50s, had to marry women and have a family, that those loveless marriages with a contorted and dysfunctional psyche in the role of the patriarch, many of whom had to go off on the side into filthy and potentially dangerous sexually transmitted, environments in order to cheat on their wives who didn't understand why their husband was so distant, or maybe they did on some level understand it, and they had to keep it hidden from their own souls. These tight-lipped, tight-assed 1950s households where closeted men had to eke out an existence, that was better for those children than the children would be today in a loving same-sex household. So
I sympathize with a lot of my friends and family that identify as LGBT, a few T, mostly LGB. And I do think that they've personally suffered in a lot of ways. And the ones that are willing to share their story with me, they've really had a lot of personal.
These are gay people who've chosen to be in heterosexual relationships.
I know a couple of them, but most of the ones that I'm talking about haven't. They're not necessarily married or have children, but they've really endured some pretty significant personal challenges. The solution is not to make a motherless or fatherless child. Whatever it is that you've struggled with, I hope that if you identify as gay or you have same-sex attraction, or however you want to label yourself or identify yourself, I hope you have wonderful people in your life that are offering you community and friendship and bearing your burdens. But the solution for somebody who experiences same-sex attraction is not to create a child who has to lose a relationship with their mother or father. So again, here we have who is going to do the hard thing.
On the lose a relationship thing, because so you see a sunny picture of a same-sex couple with their children and so on, and what is hiding behind that, from your perspective, is the absent mother or the absent father in the case of a lesbian couple, right?
By definition, the child has lost a
biological parent.
A full or partial relationship. They do not have their own mother and father in their home every day, 100% of the time, which, like, from a child development standpoint, is sort of the social emotional staples. Like, mother's love, father's love, and stability. Those are kind of the social emotional staples of child development from a developmental perspective. Leave aside the convention.
There are masculine ways of fathering and feminine ways of parenting that don't necessarily need to be embodied, I don't think, in the biology of a biological mother or a biological father. I think but we can follow that rabbit hole down for another day. The point that I'm making is to give you some credit for noting that, sunny lesbian family, lesbian couple, they've got their kids. What we're not seeing in that picture is that a biological father has been erased from that picture. And so, to some extent, you could say those children have lost a parent. Sounds very emotionally evocative. To me, it's a bit like saying, we all know that, you might say the worst thing, we all know intuitively that it's really terrible to lose a parent, but we're hiding that fact when we're talking about same-sex parents. That's a bit like saying we all know intuitively that when a hurricane or a wildfire rips through a community, it's terrible to lose a house that you've lived in for decades. And yet nowadays, thanks to modern society, people just buy houses off a plan and then they flip them and they sell them and they have no sort of emotional connection to their house. Like, haven't we all know fundamentally how terrible it is to lose the house that you've lived in all your life to a wildfire, and yet now people are just going around buying houses off a plan and flipping them. Well, yeah, but what's meaningful about the house is the fact that you built a relationship with that house. What's meaningful about a parent is that you built a relationship with that parent. What's meaningful about the house is that it contains all of the things that you love. What's meaningful about your relationship with a parent, which makes the loss of a parent so devastating, is the accumulated history that you have with them, the connections that you have with them. As I say, 3 seconds ago, we've been able to technologically and culturally isolate the biological link and sort of transplant it into a new family structure. And I think what you're doing is you're carrying along all of the negative connotations of losing the house that you've spent your life building in a wildfire, and you're claiming that the person who buys a house off a plan and flips it is inflicting that same level of damage. And it's just not true. We're just talking about different phenomena.
I think you're exactly right that the connections that we have with the people that raise us, the bonds, the memories, the relationships, that daily interaction is really meaningful and it's really, really important. And that is a huge aspect of what it means to be a parent. But if you want to exclude the biological aspect, I think that you're doing that. I mean, to me, that's a religious argument. I'm not making the religious argument. I'm making a argument that is consistent not just with the human body, not just with how families have always been made, not just with the decades of social science research. I'm making the argument
But
based
again,
in...
the decades of social science research relate to how painful it is to lose a house that you've lived in all your life, not to how painful it is to buy a house off the plan. The decades of social science research, in other words, are about the bad impact on kids for losing a parent who they love, for having an abusive step parent, for living in, a dysfunctional family.
So
all of the data that we talked about earlier, which have to do with situations in which a stable, loving, well-off couple choose to bring life into the world in the context of a broad, loving, both nuclear family and extended family, especially in cases where the children know the birth mother or have some relationship to their genetic lineage, those social studies all don't prove what you say, that what you're claiming. I mean, they prove the reverse.
So again, there's very few reliable studies on children raised in same-sex-headed households. Like, there are very few
I just read about a dozen of them.
You read a dozen that used really poor methodologies that seem to be rushed to production to advance a political cause. There are some
not
good
all of
studies.
them. Many of them are good, including the Dutch one.
A handful of them are good. And then you have to compare them against the decades that show that mothers and fathers offer distinct and complementary benefits that unrelated adults generally do not bring the same level of advantage to children.
But that's because most of the unrelated adults in those studies are not committed same-sex parents or committed parents who brought the children into existence. If you include all of the infertile couples who've had an egg donor, but in every other respect the family is the same, then all of those differences go away.
They don't. I mentioned the largest sperm donor study that we have that did use robust methodologies, that did compare sperm donor children who were very often raised, 100% of cases, raised by their biological mothers.
So we don't end up going around in circles about data. Let me grant you what I don't believe is true, that it's worse for kids to be in families that don't have a biological mother and a biological father, even if you adjust for all of the other factors, right? So, let's forget about the cohorts of families from kids from broken homes and so on. Is it also the case that it's bad for children to grow up in poverty?
So there's all different kinds of traumas and disadvantages that children can face. Poverty is one of them, certainly abuse.
So should we have a means testing for children? Like, I just don't quite understand why this particular metric of well-being is the one that you're at, you're a dog with a bone on.
Just
there are
because,
so many ways for children to flourish or not flourish.
And interestingly, most of those ways of flourishing are connected to family structure. that if you want to exempt children from poverty, you will, in whatever case you can, unite them to their own mother and father, married together for life.
But
if you want to exempt children from a variety of...
Should we oppose grindingly poor people from having kids?
I think that there's a difference. So there's a difference between permitting and promoting, right? You can permit adults to make all different kinds of decisions, and we have mechanisms to remove children from situations of significant abuse or neglect. Those scenarios and those systems need to be... obviously have a lot of struggles to them, but that is the kind of complexity when you're seeking to strip children of their mother or father. It actually should be hard to separate children from their biological mother and father. It should be hard to reattach them to biological strangers. That's what CPS in the United States really has to wrestle through. It should be hard for a reason. Reproductive technologies makes it easy to cut and paste children into any and every adult relationship, even if the parents aren't vetted, even if
right,
there's no genetic relationship.
A poor, dysfunctional couple who are just struggling to make ends meet are much more likely to bring life into this world by having sex than they are by going through IVF or some donation process.
We know that there are ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, a variety of different things that actually can impact children, affect their psyche for life, right? And it's things like having a mentally ill parent or seeing a domestic violence situation or having a parent that's incarcerated. I mean, all of those different... divorce is also an ACE, right? Like what you're saying, the house that has burned down and you've built all these memories in it. But interestingly, the best system that humans have found across religions, across eras, is a child raised by their own married biological mother and father seems to be the best vehicle so far that we've discovered as a species to exempt children from a lot of the other kinds of harms, poverty, abuse, things like that human children have always been vulnerable to. So I concede that there are other really major issues that children can face, but I feel like it's a bit of a red herring to say, shouldn't we focus on that without focusing on the vehicle that tends to deliver children away from a lot of those social ills? Because it does.
Yes, but we've got an alternative model of the vehicle contains a lot of parts, right? The loving structure, stability, care for the children, maybe the different dynamics between a maternal instinct and a paternal instinct. I'll grant you that. There are lots of things that are good about a nuclear family, and you're saying that traditionally that has been proven to, enhance the well-being of kids, which I agree with. And it's probably why, we still retain the structure of a two-person household, even in same-sex partnerships. We've only just, again, 3 seconds ago, created the cultural and legal and technological ability to take that nuclear family and replicate it whilst tweaking just one of those variables, which is the sex of the parents.
It's a massive experiment.
And keeping all of... and so far so good, according to the studies, right? Except for the 2 random ones that you've cited that my research did not bring up, but I'll look into, but I would be surprised if they were perfectly impartial. So, I mean, you've got we are doing an experiment, you're right. And we should be cautious. I think you're right to say, let's just be careful about what we're doing here. Let's not assume that our right to our own self-fulfillment, and to have children trumps the well-being of the kids. But in order to argue for a radical inhibition or prohibition on the ability of consenting adults to construct a family, you would also need to show significant downsides for the children, or really any downsides for the children. It's the lack of those downsides that I find unpersuasive.
There are many downsides. We've discussed some of them.
But they all apply to non-relevant scenarios.
No, the identity struggles, the intentional and commercial separation of children from one or both genetic parents overwhelmingly harms children. I mean, it literally flies in the face of all of the adoption best practice that we have developed over a couple different decades in getting to the point where we want to make sure that children have a relationship with or biological knowledge of their parents and as much contact as possible as it's safe for the children. It flies in the face of what we know, that children benefit from a female parent and a male parent, that men do not mother and women do not father, and kids need both.
We can grant all of this, and we can also say that it's better for children not to grow up in poor households, so why aren't we banging on about how poor people shouldn't have children?
We are banging on about how if we want to create a thriving society, we do need parents who are committed and married to one another, because that is the best anti-poverty weapon. So in the United States, we have...
you could also just stop poor people from having kids.
Well, so now you're getting to the point where we're saying, look, the solution to poverty is actually, there's something called the success sequence. And it's very well known. And it is that if you want to not live in poverty, you have to do 3 things: graduate from high school, get married, and then have children. If you do it in that order, 93% of adults will not live in poverty, and by extension, their children will not live in poverty. You get that out of order,
sure, but
and
now
you're
you're
going to
talking
have
about
poverty.
edge cases. I mean, we're talking about norms here, right?
The norm is 93% of people and their children will not live in poverty.
The norm is that most people who have a child at the age of 16 when they're in poverty are not going to do those things.
Right, because they have not followed the sequence. So we need to be clear that there is a sequence, that you're not a victim. It's like, you do not have to live in poverty. You do not have to have children who live in poverty. You have volition. You have agency. There are choices that you can make to make sure that neither you nor your children are going to live in poverty. But what does it take?
And there are choices that gay people can make to ensure that their children are well.
There are choices that gay
parents... But you're
parents...
arguing for an absolute position on one and a flexible position on the other. We know that there are groups of people who are, in your worldview, inimical to the well-being of children. One of those groups might be gay parents. Another might be poor parents. In the case of gay parents, you say we should just prevent them from having kids altogether.
I'm not preventing you.
Parents,
I am not preventing you from having children. Your body is preventing you from having children.
It is not. You're preventing it. Yes, you are preventing me from having children, because I have to avail myself of technologies that need to be legal in order for it to happen. But you're saying that we should allow, with poor people, well, it's complicated. They should follow a 3-step program.
It's not complicated. I just said there's a sequence.
Why not just ban them from having kids?
Well, first of all, because if you're
in the business of banning people from starting families, then why are you being selective about gay people?
I'm not banning. So I'm not banning you from having children. Your choices and your body has made it difficult for you to have a family.
That's just trivially true. Like, I have a family that I wouldn't be able to have in your regime.
I think that children's right to their mother and father should be respected, and you guys bypass that right. You're working outside of the system that your body has set up to create human children.
Does a child have a right to 3 meals a day and to a loving family?
So the good news is, if they are raised by their own mother and father, they are much more likely to get 3 meals a day.
We're not talking about likelihood. We're talking about absolute rules. We're talking about who's allowed to do what.
Then the absolute rule is you and your husband shouldn't have children.
Right.
That's the absolute rule.
Good. And then the absolute rule should also be that if a poor family can't provide 3 meals a day and a loving environment, they shouldn't be allowed to have children either.
Well, the amazing thing is that we've had an awful lot of children created in... My husband and I lived in poverty, very close to the poverty line for a long time. Poverty can be an ace, but it is not necessarily an ace.
And it is not necessarily the case that a gay family can't raise well-adjusted kids. We're not talking about probablys. We're talking about what is permissible.
I think that they can.
And if the moral principle is that children have to be raised by loving parents who can feed them 3 meals a day and give them support and raise them just as well adjusted as anybody else.
Then buy and sell kids on the open market, no big deal.
When we see families who are obviously incapable of doing that because they're grindingly poor, why don't we prevent them from having children?
We tend to remove them. If they're grindingly poor and it's leading to abuse and neglect, we remove them.
And we should remove them?
We do remove them. Very often,
but
if
you're
there's
the one who's
neglect or
on
abuse.
About how important it is for a child to be with their biological parents.
That's why it should be very difficult, why it is very difficult to remove the child from their biological mother or father, because it's very hard to find another scenario and another couple that is going to be able to replicate statistically the level of benefit. Now we're talking about exceptions. There are exceptions. You have to address the exceptions. And let me say, I'm not saying that you guys are not loving your children. I'm sure you guys are. I mean, from all that I've read quickly before, in the last 24 hours when I knew that we were doing this, your children are beautiful. And it looks like you guys are very invested in them, very committed
thank you.
To loving them.
You just want to create a world in which it's not possible.
I want to create a world where they don't have to lose their mother to come into existence. And to me, that is not the fanatical perspective. The fanatical perspective seems to be that we are going to be able to buck everything that every society all throughout history and our own bodies lead us to conclude. To me, I'm just arguing for the common sense position. To me, the world that says that 2 men can manufacture a child through commercial processes, what is very often commercial processes, intentionally deny children a relationship with their mother, To me, that's a religious and ideological perspective, not mine. Mine is just the biological perspective.
So I think what happens is, and this comes back to what I was saying earlier about like there is no universe in which my children were raised by their biological mother. So the alternative is they don't exist, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I take your point that it would be extremely unproductive to tell a child, well, you should be grateful for you just existing, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's not very tactful. And it shouldn't be a rationale either. You shouldn't bring a life into a bad situation, a situation that you know is going to be terrible for them, just so that you can then retroactively say, well, if it wasn't for me, you wouldn't exist. I mean, that's almost like the logic of a factory farm or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we can mistreat the animals because if it wasn't for us, they wouldn't exist in the first place. It's not very compelling. But I do think what's happening is you've got your platonic ideal of a family.
I have the ideal that's based on how children come to be and what we know.
I don't think so. I don't think it's just that. I think you've got an ideal about a family, and this is not a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
We should all have ideals of things. We should have aspirational, idealistic visions of what we're aspiring towards and what we will always fall short from. As a Christian, you know this. I mean, this is one of the fundamental tenets of Christianity is that we are fallen and, we have to pay penance to some extent for our sins and seek forgiveness for
Thankfully, I don't have to, but go ahead. Somebody did it for me.
So there's there you go, exactly. But that's the crucial part, right? I mean, without his having done that, the whole edifice of Christianity doesn't exist. So, ideal family, mother, father, they're loving, they love each other. The children are happy. No one is suffering from disabilities. The father is not an alcoholic. The mother isn't popping pills. They have a stable community. They live in a culture that is thriving and flourishing and non-discriminatory and non-prejudicial and that is supportive and communal, right? There's this family. And I understand that what's happened over the past few decades with the rise of wokeness and a perhaps extreme gender, let's say playfulness to be charitable to it, or gender, disruption, is that there's been an attack on that as an ideal. That ideal has come under fire from an extreme secular left. And my suspicion is that you are justifiably, as a Christian conservative, motivated to oppose this attack on, as you say, the most fundamental and useful unit that has ever been devised in culture, which is the loving family. And losing a parent is terrible. We've made it much, 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 much less terrible. There are all kinds of ways in which real-life families fall short of the ideal of the family. That one of them might be going through mental health problems. Their marriage might be really, really full of animosity that is rubbing off on the kids. They might be arguing all the time. They might be encountering financial problems. They might lose their home. And there are all kinds of different ways in which families can fail to live up to our expectation of an ideal family. But your antipathy to wokeness, maybe coupled with your religiosity, is driving you to focus on one particular way in which families can fall short, which to me seems to be an undue focus, given how flourishing and thriving families like my own can be. And you seem to have a lot of blind spots toward the other ways in which families fall short. And the only example of a modern incarnation of a fallen family that you're focusing on and comparing to the ideal is mine.
Except that I rail on an awful lot about IVF and how we are screening children out of existence through IVF, and how I think that it's unacceptable for heterosexuals to use sperm and egg donors as well, and how we talk a lot. I have an entire chapter in my first book about divorce and the harms of divorce, and how divorce is the thing that kicked off the waves and waves and waves of trauma that children experienced, especially through the 80s and 90s. And that I also harp on an awful lot about polygamy as well. And that I'm very critical about how even the pro-life world talks about adoption, how adoption is not the fix for unplanned pregnancy. Parenting is. And that adoption is not an infertile couple's solution to having children. Adoption should be child-centric, and it's not about adults. So you and I are talking a lot about gay parenting and things like that, obviously, because this is kind of where it intersects with your world. But I really am an equal opportunity defender. I really will critique any adult who is asking a child to sacrifice their right to life or their right to their mother and father. I mean, I do all kinds of Instagram reels about the divorce industry of all these female influencers, who are talking about how your kids are going to be fine if you leave their father and, go because you're the real guy who really understands you. He's out there and now you're going to be free. And what's nice is then you can have 3 days to yourself and you can get all your reading done and you can do travel and your husband's watching the kids, but you don't have as much housework to do. So, I understand why you're characterizing it this way, but it's not accurate.
Okay.
If you go to my Twitter, you'll see that I actually offend everybody or critique all of that.
Got it. Let me then remove the component of being selective about gay people and just leave in the component about being selective then about, I suppose, the artificial creation of children, right? And this focus specifically on the biological link with biological parents.
Yeah.
I still think that's an undue focus given all of the constellation of other things that can go wrong with in a family.
Yeah.
And I think one of the missing jigsaw pieces is that, as I said, children aren't going to remain children forever. One of the things that creates a flourishing family, like one of the things that we would want out of this platonic ideal of a family, would be a community that is non-discriminatory and thriving, where adults are well-adjusted. And
you totally want well-adjusted adults.
Yeah.
That's true.
And I'm not sure that a vision of the world in which gay people's aspirations are thwarted or they're in loveless straight marriages, in which people who are infertile and can't avail themselves of reproductive technologies, in which all of those people are living lives of quiet desperation, is like, do you factor that in at all? Does that count at all in your thinking about the relative upsides or downsides of the world into which you're bringing a child?
I'm really, really empathetic for people that wish they could have a baby and can't.
But does it have an impact on children, for those children to be surrounded by a large cohort of adults, aunts and uncles and so on, who all feel that way?
So the interesting thing is, the adults are choosing loss for children. I don't think
they're choosing what for children?
Loss. They're choosing loss for children. The heterosexual couple that wants to have a baby that is going to create 15 embryos but only implant 2, and the other 13 are going to be donated to research or thawed or frozen and then thawed and discarded as medical waste. Whatever experience you're having, whatever feelings you're having or desires or longings or losses, I don't think you should make kids sacrifice for you. I don't think any adult should force children to sacrifice for the sake of their mental or emotional health or well-being.
Yes, all right. So if you bring into the moral equation the well-being of the blastocysts who are going to get flushed down the toilet because through the IVF process, then I can see what you're saying, that you would rather have a world in which a significant minority of adults are thwarted in their aspirations and society is more judgmental, more prejudicial, more discriminatory in order to save the lives of the blastocysts. But if you're only focusing on, let's suppose that you grant me the secular version of who should be in our sphere of moral concern, and we're only talking about real living children who are outside the womb and who are living conscious lives, do you think that the world is still better for them to be in an environment in which all of those adults are thwarted?
I think that the worldview that says, I decide whether children live or die, come into existence, have their mother or father in their lives, that mentality of children exist for me, I don't think that that's good for adults or children. And that really is what's going on both in the world of in the world of abortion, in the world of IVF, in the world of creating intentional homes where you're separating children from their mother or father. It is this mentality of the kids exist for me. And I don't think that that's just. Ultimately, it might meet the adult's immediate needs, but it's at the expense of fundamental child rights.
I mean, I would not support it either if I thought that were true. If I thought that it only met adults' needs and it was inimical to the well-being of children. Can we
talk about discrimination? Because you kind of threw that in there. Like,
if
I get what I want, it's a discriminatory world. And I just think that it's interesting that a lot of the different advancements of adult so-called equality results in child inequality. That if an adult is going to have the equality that they want or that they desire in marriage or parenthood, it results in child inequality. That children are going to lose something that they have a right to, their mother or father, so that adults can have what they want. And so there again, I think you see the choice, the trade-off. Who is going to be put first? Is it going to be them or is it going to be us? And I'm not saying it's a small thing for a gay couple or an infertile couple or a struggling marital couple to put them before us. We're talking about some of the biggest things that adults are going to deal with. I just don't think that it means that children should struggle so we don't have to.
Nor do I, if it were true that children were struggling as a result specifically of the things that we're talking about and not extraneous things that have traditionally been associated with them. Lastly, so in the future, what's your sort of ideal outcome? And would there be any data that would persuade you otherwise, or is this a belief that's impervious to
So far,
facts?
the data is pretty well aligned with biological reality. And the data that supposedly shows no differences in children. I mean, really, like your audience can go look
Just
at them.
hypothetically, let's not rehash the data that we've been talking about.
Yeah.
Hypothetically, if it came out that there were studies that show, I don't think, because my suspicion is that you wouldn't be swayed either way. That this is not an argument based on facts on the ground, but it's a principle for you. It's a moral. It's a moral principle.
Well, this position that you can create children that are intentionally missing their mother or father, like you said, arrived in the last 5 seconds of history. And so what we're talking about is something that reorients all of the data, the common sense, the biological realities of like the mother's body in relation to infants, both in utero and after the baby is born. What you're talking about is data that aligns with an understanding of the human person that rejects biological reality. Now, we are moving towards a place where we're going to be able to have things like artificial wombs and create children in mass. We are looking at things like in vitro gametogenesis, where you can create egg cells from a man's skin or saliva, and you can have two adults that are biologically related. You can have a man who's both the mother and the father of the child. I mean, we're moving into we are really overhauling the nature of humanity and the nature of what it means to be a child in a variety of different ways. We've started down that route with IVF and surrogacy. It's going to continue to go. What is the data going to say about
Well,
them?
I mean, those are all scary things, and there are good reasons for secular people to be worried about some of those incarnations as well. I'm just saying, let's suppose hypothetically that it came out that actually what is the most salient metric for a child is that they have a stable household, two loving parents of either sex, and that we see consistently over time in studies whose methodology you support that that's superior. But you still wouldn't back it.
Well, let's say that that was the case. It's interesting, one of the things that I do is catalog the stories of children in a variety of different family structures. Many of them have LGBT parents or same-sex parents. Some of them feel like I was connected to both of my mothers. But it's interesting because a lot of those kids, many of those kids will say, even though my needs were met and it was loving and I was raised in a non-discriminatory, tolerant community, I wanted a father. I wanted to be loved by a man.
No, I'm saying hypothetically.
What I'm saying is, I think that the data doesn't tell the whole story. I think that children long to be loved by a man and a woman. They long to know their mother and father, and that this goes right down to the core. Some of these things are hard to measure.
Right, but suppose you had a good measure. I mean, suppose you could do the measurement and you could ask the people and you could do all the polling and you did the longitudinal studies and you followed up, and it turned out that they were at least as well off as children of biological parents.
And it overturned all of the decades of data that we have on family structure. Well, then that would be really something.
No, it wouldn't overturn the decades of... No, it wouldn't overturn anything. I already read all of the studies about, how it's not... Once you adjust for all of the things that we know are bad, dysfunctional families, violence, all of that stuff, and you just focus exclusively on loving two-parent households, then all of the differences evaporate. Now, you say they don't. I'm saying hypothetically, if they did, would you drop your opposition?
I think that it would be really... You could make if the data was there, you would really have to re-examine, wouldn't you? You would have to re-examine your conclusion.
I don't think you would have
No,
to.
I'm saying I would have to re-examine if the data completely lined up. You had these methodologically reliable studies.
I don't think you would, though. Would you?
What I'm saying is I've met too many kids. I've met a lot of kids with same-sex parents.
Well, I mean, anecdotes are anecdotes. We've got to go with data.
Sure. The anecdotes are anecdotes.
Yeah. I mean, they're self-selecting kids who come to you, right?
That's true. Definitely the kids that feel like they cannot talk to their parents or the media or anybody else under their own name 100% come to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of them feel like they're in the closet. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I get that, life's tough in lots of ways. My suspicion is that you wouldn't change your mind, that nothing would change your mind, because it's fundamentally a moral conviction of yours, which means it's basically a religious conviction. And all I'm asking for is you should leave your theocracy in your own home and let the rest of the world sort itself out.
It's just amazing to me that that's your perspective, because I am the one that is arguing based on the biological realities and the decades of social science. You're the one that's saying, I'm the one that's religious, when you're promoting a worldview that has existed for 5 minutes of history, that takes incredible technological tinkering to advance, that overrides everything that we know about the nature of the parent-child relationship. You are the one with the religious worldview here, not me.
Katy, I'll leave you with the last word. Thank you.
No, I want to say something.
Please.
You're a really great host.
Oh, well, thank you.
You're a great interviewer.
Guest.
You're gracious. You came really well prepared. You obviously are a good guy. And I wish you and Sean and your kids the best.
Thank you, Katy. I wish you the best too. Thanks for giving me your time.
Yeah.